Hi everyone, this is Surya from Document360 team. It's wonderful to see you all here today. So I'm thrilled to be your co-host for this tonight's webinar, and I just want to start by thanking for setting aside time in your busy schedule to join us. So now it's time to dive into today's session, and I'm excited to introduce our speaker Federico Marafin, who's a senior technical writer at Excel. So a little background about Federico. So he brings a unique blend of technical expertise and humanities perspective to the field of technical writing. And with a focus on crafting user-friendly documentation and developing impactful content strategies, Federico excels at streamlining technical communications and enhancing knowledge management. And his work not only supports product success, but also ensures users can fully understand and leverage the tools at their disposal. So in today's session, Federico will explore the role of context in technical communication and share actionable insights to help you create documentation that empowers users and also enhances their experience. As always, we want this webinar to be as interactive as possible. So with that said, the floor is all yours, Federico. Over to you,
Well,
man.
thanks, Surya. And first and foremost, thanks and hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, wherever may it be, and thanks for participating. And I'll just start sharing my screen so we will get the presentation going. So let's start. Okay, so let's start with the first. So an overview of what we will be discussing here, what I will try to convey in this webinar. I will try to avoid oversimplifying and avoid delving too deep in details just because we have some time constraints and as much as I would like to discuss every single bit of information, I would like to cover all the topics that we have for today. So starting from information to knowledge. In this area, I'll try to describe what is the idea behind those words, why we say information, why we say knowledge, why it's relevant in for our technical communication purposes, to be aware that the concept of knowledge and to providing value to our users is different from just compiling information. Then, talking about users, I will continue with the user-centric documentation, or at least the concept of documentation persona. In this case, I wanted to bring the idea of the technique of creating documentation personas just to again highlight the importance of what is relevant for our users, what is our purpose, what is our intent as technical communicators creating technical documentation or managing knowledge hubs, and what to do in order to bring this information, this value to every single component of our audience, which can be diverse. And speaking about how language or how words convey their meanings and what is the role of context, especially when we need to think that someone that needs to understand or someone that's starting or beginning to learn from our documentation something from scratch, the role of context and how it's important in creating the significance of words, and how in this case I will not describe the entirety of the research of Wittgenstein, but I will try to just explain the concept, the theory of language games, and why those are relevant for proper technical communication, and a couple of examples. At the end, and it's not the end, but it's basically a sort of looping component. Why feedback is important, how to, again, thinking about the user, thinking about the documentation, the value, what to do, and what feedbacks, how we might create a good feedback loop, and what processes we might use, and also what to avoid. So information versus knowledge. So everyone, more or less, at least people that speak English, we are not holding this webinar in another language. So I will use the etymology and the words of the English language. So information generally is used as a word to describe something, an amount of data, code, text that exists that we can be aware of. Uh, the interesting thing is that this word come from Latin, and the etymology here is informare, form basically. Also in English is kept a similar significance. So to shape, to give structure or delineate. And from raw data to information. So knowledge, on the contrary, is just not something like information being compiled and like pieces of information standing one close to each other. No, it's also on top the understanding and having familiarity with the skill and the experience of. So we can go. I'm not a linguist, so please pardon me if I mispronounce something. But there, at least starting from the linguistic aspect, the Proto-Indo-European language that we have ways of understanding the root words, but not the entire sentences. The root gine or gene means to know or recognize. In Sanskrit, it appeared as nya or jnana, and again meaning knowledge. In Greek, the verb gignoskein, again, to know or to recognize. And in Latin, we have cognoscere or cognoscere, which get to know or again to recognize. And we get the knowledge from the Old English nawan or no one. So again, to know. But why we are talking about knowledge, information, is just because when we have information, that's something that we might be aware. So when we create documentation, we might add information just because it is something that is valuable to be aware of, but that's not enough. So for example, the fact that pizza is a typical dish of Italy is information, or humans have the ability to cook, not animals. That's another information. But how from information you get to having actual the actual capability to do something, to reach an objective, to be knowledgeable on a topic, a specific topic. If we just want to create content and create documentation that is a plethora of information, then we just create an index. But as you know, an index is not the core of the core of the content. So we have this is I will introduce the concept of knowledge that and knowledge how. This is this basically arises from the field of epistemology, but just let's use this example. So information and knowledge, but again, knowledge when you have not enough familiarity, when you are not enough knowledgeable, you just list something. Or in this case, if I want to make pizza, okay, the information is pizza exists, is a dish. Okay, knowledge that is I want to make a pizza and I know that I need some ingredients, I need an oven, I need a series of things, but I'm lacking the finesse, the context, and all the practical and necessary skill to actually bake a good pizza. Knowledge how, on the contrary, is knowing everything, knowing all the information, being familiar with the tools that I need to use, and on top of following a recipe, it's using the right content, using the right information to and adjust them depending on the context. So for example, if I need to rest the dough in a really humid environment, it will be completely different if I am in a dry environment. But this kind of information and usually the context is not explained thoroughly in the recipes that you find online. You need to have this sort of additional information, expertise, or even additional context. It is interesting if that happens, to get the best results. So for example, information is a user manual that is available to assist user in understanding and using the software. On the contrary, knowledge that is being able to understand that there is a manual, okay, I can use it, and also that it's specific, there is a specific hardware being described. But the knowledge how is also on top of all of this is following the manual and knowing that maybe a specific parameter that I needed for something is not well described or is not documented, and I might need something else on top of the user manual. So again, knowledge as an integration of information, context, experience with a web of meaning, a web of understanding. But why is relevant for us in technical communication? What it might matters? Just because when we compile information, it can lack clarity, it can be disjointed, it can be correct, but not enough. Okay, so due to the fact that we need to guide users, people are not reading technical documentation for the plot. Okay, so I don't think it's a leisure activity that you print the documentation, the manual, and you bring it on holidays. It might be the case, but not least for for me. What I think it's interesting for technical documentation are the challenges and the strategy that governs these kind of activities. And for example, if we want to have a better understanding on what is available, what is useful for our documentation consumers or for other SMEs, other subject matter experts, we need to understand that it's not just about getting that bit of information, but is to provide context. So basically, the seed of information in order to nurture and grow as a plant of knowledge, we need to provide the right soil, the right water, the right amount of water, the right amount of exposure to light. So in this sense, we need to provide the correct context, a way of understanding the topic and having better terminology or better clarity. We must be aware that we must do something else instead of just bringing or describing simple information. So we were talking about the user role, why the importance of user, but who is the user? Or what are our users, more or less? Usually, it's not just about one user and that we need to create the documentation for. We find ourselves creating content that needs to be tailored, but to whom? So a concept here is the idea of documentation personas. So the purpose of creating a documentation persona will be to create a sort of archetype of a user or a category, a class of user from research and data analysis. So this is really important. We cannot make assumptions. We need to have this grounded with some data, interviews, one-on-ones, feedbacks, forms. Again, it's a collection, is collecting information about your audience. You might need to create a guide that is a user guide, so something entry level, or you might need to create something that is higher level for some experts on the field that you are writing. Sometimes you need to find the correct balance between the two, okay, and create just one single piece of documentation. Or creating personas might be useful for the design options, for designing and to saying, okay, this content needs to be split because we cannot have everything just in one single article. It will be too much. So creating personas and identifying what are the needs, what are the challenges, what is the required context for each audience is relevant and is important for technical communication. So the creation process, you create personas, create a sort of fictional character that embodies the characteristics, goals, and challenges of a portion of your audience. Then you can use personas in design. So if you can create a user-friendly manual because you were thinking about those two specific entry low-level persona, low level at least, low amount of information, prerequisite information required, you can draft a good document. Or even if you can, I'm speaking about software here, but if if a product owner finds your personas valuable, they might be useful for backlog, for strategy, for strategic decisions, for design. So in this case, the key benefits of using personas is that it can help you both on a documentation side, but also on the knowledge management. If you are a documentation manager, it might those might be useful in order to make the correct choice, the right choice. If you need to say no, we need to create two different articles, two different guides because this is too much, you can have an objective choice. You collected the data and then you made an informed decision on what to do. For example, if you need to if you want to tailor the content just to a specific user persona because you know that they will be the sole documentation consumer, perfectly fine. You have tailored your documentation. The best practices, of course, it's keeping regular updates, developing detailed persona. So one important thing is to avoid making the personas too generic. It's important that you start from the complexity. You start basically you have a top to bottom approach. You start with the most amount of details and then you refine the persona to an archetype. And common mistakes to avoid, I will repeat myself, is assumption. So you need to ground these in real data. I will say that if you start thinking about generic archetype or the senior developer, no, this doesn't work. Talk with your colleagues, one-on-ones, create forms. It's written. And again, oversimplification in the sense that the nuances here help you into creating a persona, but you might be the creator, but not the user. So if it makes sense for you, and again, the fil rouge of this webinar, if the context of the information makes sense to you, you also need to be aware that it must make sense also for a colleague of yours using personas. A PO, someone from marketing might be interested in these personas just because you spend some time having interviews or collecting data. So this is a simple example of an SME user and then a basic user. So you can collect the background, the characteristics, the needs, the challenges. But this is just an example. This is not set in stone. Feel free to tinker with this example or to create an entirely new one. So in this case, we are trying to capture what role is, what are the characteristics. So in this case, both have the will to learn, both are interested in continuous learning. But for example, the difference here is that the newcomer doesn't want to find hundreds of page long articles. I'm exaggerating, but with all the code snippets, code examples, links to user stories, link to tickets, that could be too much. And on the other side, a newcomer might want just how-to guides, or the software functionalities being introduced, just because he has no clue of how the software works, how it's structured, why it's structured like that. So, for example, if you need to create an article, you might use conditional formatting, private notes, or any way in making sure that you can make visible one part of the documentation and to one specific reader group, instead of making everything available for every single user. Maybe the newcomer is part of a reader group that sees a portion of the document or the article, and then after training, after qualifying for it, it can be added to a higher reader group with additional content being visible. This is a sort of a gimmick, an example, but this is what more or less I'm trying to convey here. So, documentation persona, we talk about how context is relevant, in the sense that you need to be aware that there is always a context being presumed. So I will not bore you with plenty of details regarding philosophy, but one key thing that I brought from my previous philosophical studies is that quite often philosophy is not about thinking about this, creating the theory about that, but making sure the things that we consider as common, normal, or to take for granted are evident, are clear. What are the pre-assumptions? Like, if I do not share, like, if I do not have a sort of light on top of what is the background, what is taken for granted, this taken for granted might have a different outcome depending on the context, depending on what's taken for granted. Because if I'm taking for granted something, me, it might not be the same for someone in 5 years, in 10 years, from the other side of the world with a different background than mine. So the idea of highlighting context and highlighting what is the role of meaning, the significance, this is sort of what I wanted to bring here. So I'm trying to take a small bit of philosophy and put it inside the technical documentation, technical communication, just because to me it was interesting as a concept of how do we improve documentation, how do we provide more value to users. An idea will be to have them be knowledgeable, have them knowledge and not just aware of information, but how do we make sure that it's the case? So a step back. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, a German philosopher, 20th century. His works, he has done a lot of research in the philosophy of language and also some contribution to analytical philosophy. End of story, no more philosophy. So basically, Wittgenstein tried to understand how language is, like, what are the inherent rules of language, why the grammar is done in such a way, why the grammar is different between one language and the other. But at the end, he found himself finding that the meaning come from the meaning of a word or sentences come from use and not inherent properties. This is just a theory, of course, but it's interesting for us, and I will explain why. The theory of language games is a way of showing that words gain meaning in the day-to-day life and through the context in a way of we follow some game rules. So that the contextual meaning is given just because we use a language, we have a context, and depending on the context we are using those words, the result may be different, may change. So I will start a couple of quotes, but again, the idea is not we need to thoroughly describe every single context, every single Wittgenstein uses a term called family of meaning. So if we are inside proprietary software, we are doing documentation for a tool that has a knowledge hub that is set to private. So you need to acquire the tool itself before being able to train and know the documentation. You are starting from zero. You have no prior knowledge. You have no previous exposure to that kind of content. So you're not a part of the family of meaning. You might lack the context required for understanding in the correct way, and in order to create, in order to build knowledge, the information that it's being displayed to you. So a simple game. Someone yells duck. Okay, so depending on if we are depending on the context, this might have different meanings. So an animal versus dipping or avoid. So imagine we are in a forest, we are bird watching, and someone yells duck. Oh, that's a duck. Okay, look for a duck. That's the meaning, that's the significance. The context is like bird watching, checking for animal, looking for animal. But imagine that we were playing paintball. Uh, Now the term duck, okay, even if it's funny, uh, has a different meaning. It's dip, avoid getting shot by the other contestants. So again, case number 2, draw the bow. Okay, you are given a notebook and you need to draw the bow. Which one? In this case, the way that it was phrased was ambiguous. These are corner cases, of course, but I'm trying to make an example. Language game is something that, if you have the right context, or if you are within the family of meaning, you get the information. Why it's a language game? Because if you are participating in the game, or if you know the rules of the game, then you know what's expected from you. Then you have knowledge on what to do. But if you receive the information, draw the bow, which one do you draw? The ribbon or the longbow? Again, case 3, draw the bow. Again, well, depending of if we were thinking about creating an image, drawing the bow made sense. But if we were thinking about drawing the bow in order to reach a target, then again, the language game and the context is different. This was just a silly game, some silly examples, but for us technical communicators, the role that context has is not that is not to be like we need to be aware of it. We must have it clear in mind, and we must make sure that it's the same one that we are referring to our basically to our audience. So in this case, I brought some different contexts, using the same term throughout different contexts. So this is just an example. But for example, what about a textile manufacturing scenario? So let's imagine, okay, that we have this information. Okay, so again, the content is the software controlling the thread requires careful monitoring to prevent disruption. See the information. It's simple, it's clear, nothing wrong here. So imagine again going back, you have two different documentation personas here. An intern, someone that is coming from the manufacturing industry, and then the subject matter expert that is coming from the information technology, maybe the IT administrator or a senior developer. So imagine that you get a ticket, you have an issue report. And someone that wrote the ticket didn't want to be too much verbose, so it wrote, threads issue has stopped production. Okay, so which context is here? So theoretically, the idea is that we are within manufacturing. So I receive this ticket, I receive this report. My first idea will be, okay, something about the quality of the fabric of the fibers is not okay. So something broke and it has halted production. But maybe the report was about software. Okay, so it was referring to a set of commands that were creating a logic error, an infinite loop, and it made the software unresponsive and it halted production. So again, this is a corner case, but in our day-to-day job of creating content, providing information, we must be aware that the context is not to take for granted. At least we should be able to be vigilant and to make sure that it is well described, well documented, clarified, and also, if we can adopt better terminology, the more the better. Of course, in this case, thread, okay, was an ambiguous word. Instead of saying just thread, maybe saying the software controlling the textile thread requires careful monitoring to prevent disruption. So in this, with a simple change of wordings, with additional context, we reduce the amount of tickets, we reduce the amount of doubts. For example, imagine that your line manager checked the ticket that you saw, and it was in a hurry, and then invited in a one-to-one to solve the issue the developer and not the quality expert on textile strength. So it's a matter of cost saving in hindsight, and it's a question of avoiding ambiguity in order to have cost reduction of time and also of time spent on something else and clarity of the documentation. So again, value to the user. We were thinking about the documentation persona, why context is relevant, why we try to have a sort of user that needs to grow within the documentation and not just receive a single bit of information. It's perfectly fine to look for a specific information, but if we want to empower our users and making sure that they know to actually operate the software or the machines or every single thing that you want to document, they need to be knowledgeable and they need to build this sort of familiarity with this sort of common understanding. And up until this moment, this was done from our active side. So in this case, we were generating, thinking, yes, with the documentation persona, we were collecting, but we were not collecting feedback on the content itself, but just on themselves. So why for me is a circular motion, and why for me it's important that we have feedback loops within any documentation procedure process, just because this is sort of Hegel, but again, enough philosophy. But in order to reach truth, okay, but in this case, in order to reach better documentation, let's lower our expectation, there is a sort of movement, a spiral-like progression. So each cycles, each new feedback builds on top of the previous documentation being created. So do not reinvent the wheel if it's not needed. Sometimes, and even myself, I will say that I fell into this trap of, no, I need to do everything by myself. I need to do everything from scratch. Yes, sometimes it's needed, but there is value in what was created beforehand, or at least, if not at the level of content, maybe on the feedback that created that content previously, on the structure itself, on some nuances of the kind of documentation and kind of information that was done in the past. So it's iterative, just because you do not, when you are done creating documentation, you need to start again. I know it's a grind, but that is something that we should strive, at least ideally. So if we try to continuously refine content, incorporating new feedback is something that adds value to the documentation. We can be a one-man army, okay, but with cooperation we get better results, believe me. So the thing is to adapt and grow, collecting the feedbacks from colleagues, collecting the feedback that you receive. Every feedback is relevant. Good feedback, like the positive, a thumbs up, is okay, because you know that the template that you were using, the way that you structured documentation was okay for the majority of your audience. You can collect the feedback and then categorize them for the different documentation personas. So you might say, hey, the template I was using is perfectly okay for new users, but doesn't kind of work for SMEs. Let's try another thing. So it brings you new ideas and this evolution that you must have while creating content. And again, validation. If you need to, when you create something of value, you need to double check if the context is clear, if the terminology is well enough described. A simple example: I do not particularly like acronyms, but they are useful. Uh, a good thing to use is introduce the acronym at the beginning of the text, and then you have a free pass on using the acronym for the entirety of the article. Or if your software offers you the option, just by hovering the mouse on top of the term, you get the glossary. Okay, so said this, you need to test your documentation against different documentation persona if you wanted to go that way. But again, the importance of having the correct approach to feedbacks, it's really, really important. Just because you thought something was correct and you consider yourself an expert, there is always something of value in the consumer, the documentation consumer, in the reader, in your audience. Just because you might like get 99% correct, but that what's left is important to be heard and then applied. What to avoid? We do not want to listen to everyone. This is a bad way to say things, but let me explain. So we need to be aware that not all feedbacks are to be integrated immediately. We must be a sort of filter. And this connects again to the idea of creating the correct kind of knowledge. Imagine that we are a plant and some wind from the left makes us bend, then again, another wind from the right makes us bend again. So no, we must find our stability at the center. We might be flexible, but we do not want to break. Why so? So the idea here is to try to listen to everyone, but then the voice of one documentation persona or the voice of someone higher up, it's important, it's valuable, but it must benefit the whole. Okay. Again, Aristotle, the sum of the whole is more than like the whole is more than just the sum of the parts. If we take the content, if we take information and we create knowledge, we have created something that has a better quality than just an index of information. And in the same way, if we listen to the voices and then if we listen to the feedbacks and then we create we try to integrate them in the documentation, it's important to be aware of some shortcomings. So for example, If we fail to regularly update information or outdated information, this can lead to confusion. Maybe someone that was that had a negative feedback is just plain wrong or has outdated information. It's not our role to, we do not need, and it's better to avoid criticizing, oh, I received this information, it's not useful. We must cherish every single like and dislike and reflect on those on this kind of information that we received. And from that, we need to have a feedback loop then containing also negative content. We use it for a positive purpose. Again, overlooking dead links. This is like, for example, if someone says, I need to have access to that specific area, but that area is not functioning or not connected. So it's important that we validate the kind of feedback we received, even if it, especially, I will say, if it's negative, or at least like to make things better and not just a thumbs up, you've done a great job. Also, we cannot neglect user feedbacks. So the thing is, we might listen to the subject matter experts. We might listen to people that are absolutely knowledgeable on that matter, but also interns. Their voice is important because they offer a perspective and they offer a lack of context that is useful for us into making sure that things are well clear enough. So again, also redundant content. Someone might be happy seeing the same article, the same concept repeated and repeated. There is an issue in that, is that first and foremost, maintenance of that same information is going to take a lot of time, just because you might be forgetting to, you might forget updating that article that had the redundant content, and you, as you said, oh, I updated 7 articles on the same topic. That's enough. Maybe no, there was an eighth. So if you repeat the information too much, it can make the documentation cumbersome and difficult to navigate. Or on the contrary, if you create a too complex navigation, just because information is not redundant enough, and we must strive for balance here. I will highlight a really interesting. It was basically a presentation from Matt Dodson, a fellow technical writer, and I found it really interesting. It's about graph, not trees, and it's about our idea of having the documentation well organized instead of a more organic approach that is more user focused and arises from the user needs. So again, avoid creating overly complex navigation paths. I'm sure that the presentation will be made available, so everything is here linked. And yes, this is what I wanted to say. We had a sort of understanding on what the documentation or information versus knowledge, and then we had the user-centric personas, language games, and then at the end the importance of feedback loops. So I left a little bit of bibliography here just because then it's just opinion if it's not well documented and with some references. And thank you.
So we'll be back again with another interesting session soon, and we wish you all an amazing day ahead. Thank you all.